Hello everyone, my name is Anton Januska, and today I'd like to give you a good, nice quick start in ReactJS. Last year I did a really awesome guide for Angular. It actually stemmed from a talk that I did at a local meetup in Houston. And there were so many people that loved it. There were, so many people that were there, and so many people that actually found it useful that I decided to turn it into an article. And that article got a lot of team tree houses. Is it Team Treehouse? I think that's what it's called. Their podcast. They showed it. They demoed it, and they're like, "Hey, look, this is a pretty cool guide." And people kind of liked the way that I structured it. It explained some of the basics of Angular, and it gave you these cool, interactive demos, demonstrating how it's done with the simplest code possible, and what everything means, and just people loved it. And I was really glad that I had it available for people. So basically, following up on that, I decided to create a ReactJS talk, except I'm not giving the talk anywhere. I wanted to create a video and basically show people how you can easily get started with React very quickly, how it's not as intimidating as it looks, and go from there. This video will cover only React.js. It's not going to cover Flux. Flux I'm waiting for to do in the next video in a series. So yeah, I guess let's kind of get started. I have a cool slide deck that's available, and I'm running the server that's going to show us the examples. And I'm going to have this server available on my website, so you'll be able to go through the examples by yourself, and you're not going to have to clone the repo or anything like that. But yeah, this is available on my GitHub. It's one of the newest repos because I've just been working on it for the past couple of weeks. Let's see. Yeah, React.js example. That's going to be the examples in React.js slides. That's going to be the slide deck that I have here. So getting started with React and some Flux. So that Flux part is actually something I'm not going to be covering. That's going to come later. If you're familiar with AngularJS, this is a great talk for you. It should give you an idea of where React differs from Angular and how you're going to have to structure your code in the future. Without the Flux part, it's a little bit more difficult. Once you get a hang of Flux, you kind of realize that you should be doing these things this way in the first place. So let's talk about me. I've been a web developer for 9 years. I've been working with MV framework since 2012. I've worked with Knockout. I've worked with Vue. Vue is kind of a small framework that started as I believe it started more as a hobby than something to work with in production apps, but I used it. I worked with Angular, and now I'm working with a little bit with React. Right now I'm working as a senior engineer at a company called Landox. I'm working full-time with AngularJS and Node.js. But in the future, I'm planning to migrate some of our code from Angular to React, just so we can have back-end rendering, and well, I'll show you all about it. I'll tell you all about the cool features of React. So about React, it's considered the view layer. It doesn't have controllers, services, factories, or anything that you're familiar with in Angular. So whereas you might have an Angular project that, let's see if I have one open. I don't think I do. Whereas you might have an Angular project that has this very complicated architecture that kind of resembles the backend, React doesn't do that. React is just a view. You kind of have to come up with your own architecture and make sure that it works the way you want it to. It uses virtual DOM. That's basically a process where it kind of virtually renders what you want it to show, and then it looks at what the DOM is right now, and then it diffs it, right? Creates this series of tasks to modify the current DOM to match what you need it to look like. So for example, if your DOM shows a listing of elements, like 5 different elements, and you decide to change the order of those, but a couple of those elements will stay in place, those elements don't get changed. And those few elements that switch, React will basically just, you know, change those two elements. Whereas in AngularJS, if you change the order of your listing or whatever, it's going to re-render everything, and that's kind of the problem with Angular and why a lot of people migrate to React. Using this virtual DOM helps speed things up along, because the DOM is not that efficient when it comes to re-rendering all this stuff. It does all these things like repainting. It does a lot of stuff in the back end, and it's good that it does that. But for using you know, MV frameworks or React or, you know, any front end frameworks, it can, you know, put a huge damper on performance. Especially with, like, let's say Angular, where you might have a list of 1,000 items and you want to switch 2 of those items. Angular will re-render 1,000 items. React will actually switch to 2 items, you know. Okay, so more about React. It was created by Facebook and it's used for Facebook. Actually the Instagram application is the online Instagram application. It's just one huge React component. It has one-way data flow. That's kind of a little bit of a difference from Angular, whereas Angular is the main feature of Angular that people flocked to was its two-way binding, which meant that you could have an input in one place and an output in another place, and it would not only sync one way, but it would sync the other way. So the variable somewhere along the way, it would try to update everything else. That kind of introduced problems in more complicated applications, because the two-way binding would not always bind correctly, or the values would not get updated in the right order. React was released in 2013. It's currently used by Netflix, Yahoo, Airbnb, Sony, Instagram, and others. So there are a lot of big names that are already using React. What I find interesting is actually that, you know, React was created by Facebook and it's used for Facebook. So you're actually using this all the time. You're accessing React all the time. Whereas, you know, while Google backs AngularJS, I haven't seen any of their major applications actually use Angular. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. You know, they don't use it in production in any of their major applications. And lastly, React is canonically used with Flux methodology. So after React came out a few months later, I think it was only a few months later, Facebook kind of came out and said that, oh, so this is how you can use React for your applications using Flux. And Flux is basically a way of controlling the data flow and kind of making up for the lack of models, controllers, and all this other stuff. It still doesn't create an actual MVC structure, but it becomes a little bit more familiar. So let's move on. So the Angular way of doing things, you would create a module, you would attach a controller, that controller uses scope that you inject, and whatever is in the scope shows up here in your HTML. So that's kind of cool, right? So you can create these variables in JavaScript and they're automatically available in your bit. You know, whenever you, let's say here, scope.delete, whenever you delete it, maybe I can make this bigger. No, I can't. Okay. So whenever you update it by, let's say, deleting one of the items, it updates the view, and that's actually pretty neat. You know, let me show you in the guide here. Let's see if I have. I don't think I have an example. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so that looks good, right? But let's look at the problems of Angular. You see this HTTP method? Let's say we wanted to refresh our item list, right? So we create this refresh items method, and that method, let's say, gets called every 500 milliseconds to make sure that, you know, new items show up. Or you might have a button that just says refresh and it refreshes the items, right? And so this is kind of pretty easy way of doing this. It's nothing crazy. You have a refresh items function. That function is not available through the scope, but you can make it easily available by doing, you know, scope.refreshItems equals refresh items. So what's the problem with that? Let's talk about the Angular problems. Get a new set of items results in a hard refresh. That's basically something that we're trying to avoid with JavaScript frameworks, is the fact that we don't want a hard refresh. We don't want to re-render the entire page. Now with Angular and this listing, you're not re-rendering the entire page, but you are re-rendering the entire item list. So all the items are removed, all the items are re-added, even if it's only one item that changes. Or even better yet, if there are no items that change, it will still re-render just because you assigned a new value to it. The two-way binding does not always propagate, so that's an issue that I found, I often found with directives, where you might have, if you're familiar with Angular, I mean, you know what, I should have created all these like examples of Angular failures. Let's see if I have one somewhere over here. Okay, so you see how you have a, whoops. Yeah, so you see how you have a scope here. In the declaration of a Angular directive, you can do a scope and you can say that, you know, any attribute with this name, make sure that it's two-way bound. That's when you do equal. That means that whenever you update something in the directive, it updates in the parent scope, like a controller or whatever. Whenever you update in the controller, it updates in the directive. It's very easy for that to basically fuck up, and you may require to add a watch. A watch is basically adding an explicit listener on a change for that value, and you'll get both the old value and the new value back. And you can decide if you want that. If let's say that if the two values are equal, you may not want to update your directive or your controller, but if they're different, you might want to update it. And this is kind of an explicit way of stating that I'm really watching this value and I really want to know when it updates, so I can update my you know, the DOM or whatever else. Next thing is the digest does not trigger when externally changed data. So for example, with that HTTP request, HTTP is pretty good at actually watching the scope because it's, you know, it's an internal function. But if you had a, you know, a pub subsystem that's outside of Angular, the digest is not going to update, or rather the scope is not going to update and the digest is not going to run. You can easily see this in the Zerb Foundation for Apps application, or rather the library. I worked on it, so I know. But let's see, components. Modal is one of them. So you can trigger a modal with the custom Foundation API, and it'll basically, the modal will basically register itself and its ID and say like, hey, you know, if ever there's like an activate task that's passed to my listener, make sure to activate the modal. So let's see, modal directive here. So it subscribes to the Foundation API, you know, by its ID, and then it does scope show, scope hide, but then the digest has to be manually triggered. And not only that, you have to make sure that there's not a digest already running. So what's confusing is that the digest can run on its own based on certain external conditions, but it may not run at all. So you're basically stuck in this place where you have to, whenever you update some information, you have to check like, okay, has the digest been run? Is it running right now? Or and do I need to, you know, say that the scope has to apply or run the digest itself? So that can get really confusing, and if what I'm saying is already confusing to you, it really is confusing. And so the forced digest cycle can cause errors, and those errors are usually digest is in progress, and that's when you have to add this. Let me make this bigger. That's when you have to add this, you know, let's make sure that the digest is not in progress, and that's this phase thing. And if you look through Foundation for Apps, like all of their code, you'll see it everywhere, because, you know, you may click on one directive, that directive may trigger the Foundation API publisher. You know, they may publish this task or whatever and say like, hey, you know, somebody wants to open this modal, and the modal, you know, is subscribed, so it sees that, oh, okay, so I need to activate myself. And still, even though you're still within Angular and you're using an Angular service that activates or deactivates directives, you still need to run the scope that apply. So, and that brings me to my next point, the pub subflow is discouraged. So it's okay to have your own pub subflow, you know, having your own publisher subscriber system, like the Foundation API uses, and it's pretty easy to set up. But the problem with that is that problem with that is that you have to do the scope.apply. Luckily, there is a, scope.emit, scope.broadcast, pub subsystem that is within Angular. The problem is it's not very performant, and it's very discouraged. Basically, if you're using it, you're doing something wrong. That's kind of the consensus in the Angular community. Okay, next point, the data flow can be confusing, and yeah, it can be confusing because you might have two-way binding that doesn't exactly work as a two-way binding, and then the scope, especially in directives, introduces the problems. Honestly, I could go on and on, so let me just keep moving forward. The scope, there's an issue with that you can have an isolate scope in directive that has access to a parent but might not have access to some parent properties. You can have two different scopes on the same directive. You can have a controller scope that has access to a parent, and you can have directive scope that does not have access to a parent. And that controller and directive scopes may not have access to each other. It really can be just messed up. And then there are performance issues associated with all of these problems. Enter ReactJS. So there's one-way flow. That already simplifies. You already know that if you update something in a child, it's not going to update in a parent, and you have to work with that. It's isomorphic. That means that you can build React components on the backend with Node, have them compiled and basically rendered as a regular HTML, and then have React on the front end pick up from that. So that's actually really damn useful, because rendering on the backend is much faster than rendering on the front end. There's no digest cycle, so you're not going to find yourself in a situation where you update a value and it does not cycle, it doesn't do anything. The virtual DOM renders only what's necessary. That's a huge performance benefit. It's only a view layer. That means that you get the rest of the stack. It's gonna, if you think about it, similar to like how Backbone has no view layer, but it's more of like the structure for MV. So this is just the view layer. There's nothing else. There are no templates, only components. Components are very similar to directives. And while I say there are no templates, that means that there are no views associated with routes or whatever. But there is like a template-like structure, but it's a little bit different. So I'll show you that. And DOM updates on every data change. That means that it runs render almost every single time. And so that means that you don't have to worry about scope.apply. You don't have to worry about any of these issues that you have with Angular. It has first-class support for ES6 or ES 2015 as it's called now. Which means that you can build this really, you can build it very nicely. It can look very beautiful, the code. And so remember, things aren't always so straightforward. So Angular, while I'm saying all this crap about Angular, it's not a bad framework. There are a lot of things that are awesome about it. It's great for prototyping. It's great for even starting an application. But there are some issues that you will run into, and those issues are being fixed in the 2.0 update. So and one of the big changes is that there's no digest cycle, and as far as I know, there's no scope. So it kind of works a little bit differently than Angular 1.x, like what we're using now. And they basically tried to fix a lot of those problems and make it work a lot better. And I believe that it has a virtual DOM-like application, so it has something similar to virtual DOM, but it's not actually virtual DOM. And it speeds up the rendering by a lot. All right, building a component. So now we're getting to our demos. I wonder how long I've talked for. I might want to add it onto the bottom of the video that, if you actually want to see how to work with React, go all the way down here. So, we have 3 different demos. I'm going to show you JSX, which is a way of templating, basically. I'm going to show you using props, which is passing data into components and composing components together. One of the things I want to mention before I get started is that JSX is an XML-like representation of DOM, and it's always a good idea to compile that before you launch your application, but for these purposes it's going to compile in browser. So you're going to see that it's actually pretty slow. But with the amount of build tools we have today, you don't need to worry about that. Let's see. Okay, so I have this ReactJS example. I have the server running for it, so you can see localhost 3000. I'm using this a custom CMS of mine that I'm using a custom CMS that basically lets me rapidly prototype. So let's look through this. Okay, so step 1. How do you do wrap? I don't usually use Oh, there we go. I don't usually use Atom. I actually use Vim, but it's pretty difficult to like zoom in with Vim. Okay. So step one, I added some CSS. I'm using normalize and a style sheet or a bar components, whatever I'm using. Custom CSS framework that I use. There's no reason to really like spend time on that. But let's look at this. So from the start, you can see here that the HTML has nothing to do with React. You don't see any NGs, you don't see any NG app, no bootstrapping, none of that stuff. And that's kind of cool because you're going to have very clean HTML. Now let's look at this. So you can create this script type text.jsx, and our JSX transformer will pick up on that. So you actually need React JSX transformer. If you use a JSX compiler, which you should in a build step, you don't need to include this. So this is what it looks like. So you might have React.render. You can render what looks like HTML. You do document get element by ID example. So that's here, ID example. And this render text is going to show up there. So step one, this is render text. Cool. So that's pretty easy to get started. You just basically do React.render, whatever component you want, or JSX or whatever, and then you select where you want to mount that app. Let's get to more complicated stuff. We're going to create a React component. So you do React.create class, and so create class is an object that lets you create all kinds of different methods inside that are accessible. So you can do like, you know, count something. So it's like it's just plain JS, right? Like here. The only difference is that React looks for this render method to be able to figure out how it should render that component. So, you know, you can do so that's kind of cool, right? So it's more plain JS. You're not dealing with, you know, special controllers, special structures, or, you know, these dependency injections to make sure that everything's there. It's more closely, you know, a plain JavaScript experience. And so when you do return, you do this opening parentheses and closing parentheses, and inside of here you add JSX. Now JSX is an XML-like representation of the DOM. I already said that, right? So this is basically the equivalent of what I wrote below. Except, you know, since it's HTML-like, it's not exactly HTML. So when you do class, you actually have to do class name, because class conflicts with some parts of React. So you have to do this class name thing. And when you render it, you see get element by ID, example 2, we're rendering our second element. There we go. Let me zoom in on this. Okay. So when we mount it, it's gonna do class equals secondary, some React stuff, and you know, it's pretty simple. So this is our first component. You know, good job. If you're following along, you've just created your first component. Yeah, so it's that easy. And so you can notice that, you know, I didn't add a module or anything like that. It's just a variable called generated text that's an instance of this React create class. And so you can just go ahead and include that as a component of its own. So that's kind of cool. Again, you're dealing with more basic JavaScript rather than special React syntax and whatever else. So that's kind of cool, right? If it wasn't a type of create class, this would fail, or a React.create class. If there wasn't an instance of that, this would fail. But because it is, it's not failing. So that's kind of cool. So let's look at the next part. We can compose different React components together. And it's as simple as what I showed over here. You just include it in your render method. So I'm doing a var content text, and it's just going to be a span with content. Note that there has to be one root element that's going to be rendered. So you can't do, you know, this. There has to be one root element. That's kind of something that they came up with. And you can't do, just render text. It has to be wrapped in an element. So you can't do this. This would fail. But this is totally fine. Now we create another React component called secondary content. So we're doing p class name secondary. The content text is going to be this element over here, and it gets rendered. Mounted here the same way, and we have it right over here. And you'll see it's span and it's secondary. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty easy. This was our first example. First demo, I believe that demos 1 through 3. So this is basically the way we create components. We create a variable that holds the component, you do create class, and you do a render that returns some kind of HTML or a composition of other React components. What I've seen done as kind of like a regular, good practices is having a var app, right, that holds a render method. Now, excuse my sloppy Atom work. I really don't work with Atom, and I didn't want to use Vim because of the font sizing, and I didn't want to set it up with a different font just for this video. Anyway, so this is what I usually see people do, and here you would have div and all the mount points to your application. So first content, and so on. And then people usually do render app. So that's kind of, just so you know, that's kind of like what you might see out in the wild. All right. Okay, let's move on to the second step. So the second step is I'm going to be creating these cool buttons. Why is that interesting? It's interesting because we're going to be using prop names. So again, you see the HTML is completely untouched. There's probably going to be an ID somewhere over here. Yeah, ID content1, just as a mount point that's easy to find using document.getElementById. You don't need to do this, but it is usually considered best practices. So as you can see, we have these two basically identical buttons with different text in it. And kind of, if you're creating buttons that have certain functionality attached to it, you might want to create a component that deals with buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So let's start with our basic button. So we have a secondary button. It's called secondary because it uses a secondary variable. This has more to do with styling than anything else. So you see, it uses a secondary class, which has a special background and color. And it uses this.props. So in React, you have these special namespaces that I would say namespaces. You have this.props, which are properties that are passed specifically to that button, and I'll show you how that works. And you'll have this.state, and these are state variables that will change. So props don't change, state does change. Props is something that you pass from one what am I trying to say? From one element to its child. State is something that is a little bit more complicated, right? Think of it more in scope terms when you're thinking of Angular. So here we have a content block, and we want to create a secondary button. So we can go ahead and create these secondary button tags as if it's HTML, put some text in there. Now in this.props, we have this property called children, and children is basically the content of this. So if I had, I don't know, div, let's see if this works. If I decided to put a 500 pixel wide and 500 pixel high div inside of this button, that should technically work. Let's see. So we have it in there, right? It's just not showing up correctly because I'm using the wrong syntax. Let's see if we can do style. Okay, so I'm not gonna go ahead and I'm not gonna cover that. But what you can do is, include this div in there and see it's going to propagate. So whatever you put in between the secondary button and the end of the secondary button is going to be passed onto the secondary button component in the form of this.props.children. So that's kind of cool. And we can go ahead and render that, and we did. But let's say you wanted to do something a little bit more complicated. Let's say you wanted to change the type of a button, so it's not always secondary, but you might have a primary button. And let's say you want to do just a little bit more with it. So let's create a better button. So here's a better button here. You know what? I just realized that my webcam is like in this area, so you might not see most of these code examples. So let me just do this. Oops. So it shows up on top here. So we have a better button. The better button takes in a class string, or has a class string that starts with button because it's going to be a button. And what we're going to add is this button type prop. So I already showed you props.children. That's going to be the children. Props.button type is a custom prop basically. And what we're returning is class name, and you can render the string using these single curly braces. And those are kind of cool because you can render, I believe you can actually execute regular JavaScript. So let's see if this works. I need to add that. I guess it doesn't. Let's see, but it should, yeah, that should work. Yeah, so see, it actually renders, whatever is part of that variable. And that's kind of cool. And I believe you can do some cool stuff like, class string plus hello. Let's see if that works. Yeah, so you can kind of do some more advanced interpolation. In case you don't know, when Angular does interpolation with its double curly braces, it doesn't actually run JavaScript on that part of the. It doesn't actually run JavaScript on what's inside those curly braces. It uses kind of their own pseudo parser. React doesn't do that. So actually, this JSX that I'm using is an easier way to write React components. I can just go ahead and show you. I think it's on their home page. Let's see. Get started. What if I don't want to use a... Okay, see? Right here. So basically, the equivalent of this is create element null, adding hello world to it, and it's a whole step. It's a lot of different steps that React takes to create this element. But using JSX, it's much easier for us to write it because we don't have to write this crazy, JavaScript logic. And that's the reason why it can run straight JavaScript inside of those curly braces rather than some parser that they came up with. Okay. Let me check the time. I've been doing this for a while. This is going to be a long video. Okay, so yeah, so it runs this interpolation, this props children. Let's see how we can render this. So we're going to render the better button, and you see we have a prop. This is a prop. Button type equals secondary. It's usually a string unless you pass an actual object in there. If you pass an actual object in there, you're going to have an actual object available here in terms of, var object equals this, the props, button type. And this would be an actual object, JavaScript object. So you don't have to specifically say, it's a function or it's a, it has to be 2 byte bound. It's not like directives. You're basically, whatever you're passing in here goes straight to this component without any logic attached to it, if that makes sense. So that's kind of cool. And so we rendered it here. I can make this a primary button very easily. It's in this example we're passing along this button type, and it's just a class. But there could be a lot more that happens with it. For example, if it was a primary button, we might have a dictionary that whenever we're selecting whenever the button type is primary, it's not only primary, but it'll be a big button or something similar to that. So cool, yeah. Primary, secondary, and that's it. And let's look at step 3. Step 3 is going to be a little bit more complicated. We're going to do the equivalent of ng repeat, except it's not going to be ng repeat. Is this? It's not wrapping anymore. God damn it. It's not wrap. Okay. Again, we have regular HTML, nothing crazy. Our mount point is going to be here, id equals content. And I created this basic, data structure to, something that we might work with or get from an API. It's just an array with a name, description. It shows up here, and we're gonna create, a lot of stuff. So let's start from the bottom, because I think actually from the bottom it makes more sense than from the top, the way I wrote it. I don't know if you guys can see this. I really apologize that some of the earlier steps you may not have seen, what was on the bottom, what I was actually showing. I don't have that little square here. Anyway, so we're just gonna render a list of people with our data, and see, you can just pass that object through. So our people list, see, we have no ng repeat, no for each. We just have person nodes. Let me make this bigger. We have these person nodes. And so what we're gonna do is map it, and we're gonna return another component. So this is actually really awesome. So we're using, again, straight JavaScript to map. We're not using some ng repeat or Angular for each. We're not using any hacky, crazy logic. We're using a regular map. What a regular map is, for those that don't know JavaScript that well, is basically iterating through all those elements, and whatever you return creates a new list. So let's see if I can make a better example. Okay. So let's say you had that data list, right? Let's say you had a list like this, and you wanted to make a new list, and that list would be .map, and map lets you run a function in it, and you can return item, which would be 1, 2, 3, and 4 that I have right here, and you can do +1. And so what the new list would be equal to would be 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's pretty much how the map works, and it does not affect the original object. It returns a new object. That's something important to know. So when we're doing this person knows is going to be that new array, but this.props.data is not affected. So we're just doing the basic return. We're going to pass along the person and person.name property. Again, we're passing along, in this case, we're passing along an entire object, which is the person. And if you're doing like a for each, like a loop, you have to specify a key, something that's unique. Usually what people use for that is the actual index in the array, and I believe that in a map function you can just do this. The second argument will be an index. And this helps with performance, because when you change the order of items in your array, it can reuse the same elements. It doesn't have to change things. It changes less things basically. But for our example, we're just going to do person.name because that's going to be unique, and that kind of makes sense to me right now. And what we're going to return is this HTML, or it's HTML element. I have a special block list comment block that creates this nice little that creates this nice little box. And all right, let's see what next. So we passed it to person. So what is person? Person is another component. It has no class name. I kind of left it blank in case you want to add a class name. And we're again using this.props, and then we add another component called MetaList. So you can see how you can easily start stacking all of these components together and composing them. And each one has their own logic, and each one has their own requirements, their own properties that they access. and they pass on whatever information they want to the next component. So it's a very easy composable way of building applications. So we created this nice meta list. So what is this meta list? So this meta list is just basically a list. That's all it is. It has no logic. It doesn't take any props. And we come out with this. So that's kind of cool. We just rendered this entire array. We used data.map, and we mapped out whatever all these components, or we mapped out a component with all of our data, and this is what we have. No ng repeats, no ng ifs, none of that. It's straight JavaScript that you're building. You wanted to create an array of elements, and you did, and then you just rendered those elements. So that's kind of cool. Did you notice something though? It's class-based. That's great for ES6 and ES 2015. It's the same thing. It makes it very easy to create these components. It's very, very similar to directives, but it's different. There's no scope, there's no data binding. And just so you know, in these little, whatever you're returning here, you can render any type of JavaScript, so there's no scope to pass things along. Yeah, just mention that. It's all view. So this is just view logic. There's no controller, there's no directive link, there's nothing. It's just a view. You're just saying, this is what it should look like, this is where things should go. And lots of JS little declarative logic. So that's cool. And there's not a lot of boilerplate, you'll notice. So let's get to our step 4 and step 5. Step 4 and step 5 have to do with getting data. You'll see that I added jQuery here. I'm using jQuery just for simple HTTP GET and HTTP POST. And yeah, actually, did you notice you can use anything with it? So Angular has its own built-in HTTP module that helps you synchronize data better. But you have to work within Angular. With React, you don't have to work within React. You can work with whatever you want. You can build a custom library for getting HTTP requests, and it will work just as well as using jQuery. I'm using jQuery just as an example, that you get to kind of pick what you want to do with it. So we have this nice little list here. It's the same list, but this time we're getting it dynamically. I don't know why it's not going in front of my Chrome window. For anybody that has a Windows machine, have you ever noticed this kind of stupid behavior where one thing will overlap the other, but not? Yeah, it's weird. It's been a bug in Chromium for just a long time, like 3 years. I still follow it and they still haven't fixed it. Anyway, so let's start on the bottom again. So we have this ID content. We're rendering people here, a little bit different. So you know how I told you that React has these special methods that it accesses inside of your class object? So render was one of them, right? But it also has a component did mount and component get initial state. Get initial state is basically setting your data, and component did mount is basically once it's rendered and ready to be used, what do you want to do? So what is state? So we had this special namespace this.props, and this.props was either children, which was within the element, stuff within the element. So if you had or if you had a component and something was inside of those component tags, those were your children. If you had those were your this.props.children. If you have a component and you specify an attribute on it, like my title, that component, that attribute value will be available through this.props.mytitle. Okay, so that's how components can pass information to each other. Something else you can do is state. So state is kind of an internal variable that lets you update stuff throughout your object. Whenever the state is accessed or used in any way other than read, it will run, React will run the render function again. So this might at first seem kind of, unoptimized, right? if you render your list, render your HTML every single time your state is updated, it's gonna get pretty bad. You're gonna have a lot of movement, whatever, but you gotta remember this is virtual DOM. So whenever it runs a render, it looks at the structure and says, hey, I just noticed there's nothing new that showed up in our virtual DOM. There's no reason to update the DOM, so you're done. But it does run the render function. And you could prevent that, and there are some other special internal namespaces and internal nodes or methods like this. But you don't have to. You don't have to worry about it. It's pretty damn performant as it is. So we can set an initial state. Initial state is important because we're passing this data to a people list, this state. So if we didn't have get initial state, this would be undefined. Since we do have it, or since we do want to have it, we can do get initial state. This is run before render, and we just said that, hey, the initial state will be an object that has data in it. The data will be an empty array. And so when it renders without the server, this will be empty. Now, once the component does mount, once it's rendered, we're going to go ahead and run this AJAX request. So this is what I'm using jQuery. I'm going to go ahead and access this API. I'm using a CMS that I built, like I said, that has all this cool data. As you can see, it's not JSON encoded, so that kind of creates an issue. But whatever. So it returns all this cool data. If you want to use my CMS for your own prototyping, just look up Popstar CMS. Pretty sure that I have a website for it too. Do I? Yeah, I do. And it's basically like a file. It's a file-based CMS that you can set up to return, basic JSON instead of rendering out the data. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, so we're gonna get all these users, which is, oops. Oh, crap. I forgot that I'm using incognito, so you can't, reopen a closed tab. Okay. Step 4, I believe this is, isn't it? Yeah, so we're on step 4. So sorry, this is what it looks like. So it's kind of a little bit more complicated than before. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and do this. Let's set state, and we get to set the state again. Now notice that I'm using .bind this. This is a JavaScript thing. So if we want to make sure that within this function we have our entire object available, we have to do .bind this. If you're using ES 2015, you can do something a little bit different, and those are the fat arrow functions. So you'd have success, data, and whatever this is here, this over inside would be the one that's outside of here. So if you do, it'll be worth for you guys to kind of check out what this is all about. When you access this over here, it's going to be this object with get initial state, component mount, render, props, state, and all this other stuff. When you access this inside of here, without this bind, this will be completely different. It'll refer to this function in here. So it'll basically be empty. There's not going to be anything in there. And anything that you do, like set state, this is going to throw an undefined, and it's a huge mess. So instead, we have a neat JavaScript function. Oops, let me just delete all this crap that I created. We do .bind, and it lets us specify what this will refer to inside the function. We want it to refer to this outer object. So we do this .set state, and we set it data equals data. And at this point, React knows that, hey, my state's changed. I need to re-render everything, all of my children. I need to figure out what's different. We need to run all the render methods, figure out what's different, and then apply it over here. So let's look at this people list that we have here. People list, again, it's regular render. We're using this map to create a list of our people, and we're using the person thing from before and a meta list from before. So nothing new here. But I just wanted you guys to know that there's this get initial state this component did mount and the state thing. So whenever you update state, it runs render. It's good to do things in terms of state if it means that your view should change. From the ReactJS talks that I've seen, they'd like to talk about React being a state machine, which means you supply it with certain data, and when you supply it with that data, it's going to render the same exact way, or behave the same exact way every single time. So if you say that there's a person named John, that person, or let's say Antonin or Jonathan Archer from Star Trek, that person's going to render the same exact way. If you change their name, only the name changes. So it basically just, React depends on this kind of logic. And it's really cool because most of the time that's what you're dealing with. If you're supplied with the same data, it should look the same exact way. Let's look at step 5. Step 5 is by far my favorite because it shows you the power of React. So now we're doing polling. And look at how these change. So the way I have my API set up is that it doesn't order the people in a certain way. It just gets them as they get it. So right now, Anthony Junius goes first, but now Aurea Juniper is first. And it shows here. You see how it changes? 1, 2, yeah. Jonathan Archer second now. Now he's third. Let's look at how this looks in the console. So before I show you the code, I want to show you this really cool thing. So these two change the most often. You see this li element, this list element? You see how it moves? So it doesn't actually delete the element. It doesn't re-render everything. As long as I have my mouse selected on it, it's going to refer to the same exact element every single time. The bottom ones move more often, so let's stick to this one. So this is Juniper. Keep my hand on it, and now it changed into Archer, and now it's on the first one. You see how it's moving? So we're still dealing with the same element, it just gets different data rendered into it. And this is kind of the reason why people do it by key instead of by name, because every single time the name changes, it has to re-render that part. If just the key changes, that means that only the inside gets re-rendered. So you don't get this. This doesn't happen. So cool, right? So it just computes the difference and it renders it every single time. And I wonder if I can go ahead and show you guys that. Well, I will. I will show you that. This little nice optimization. Let's start on the bottom again. This is basically the same exact code as before. People. We have get initial state, component did mount, and load people. So we're gonna have this nice little internal function that does what we had to do before, gets our users. Get initial state is empty, and then we have component did mount, and we're gonna load the people, and then we're gonna set this interval. That means that every 2 seconds, JavaScript is going to run load people, this method, and this method will alter the state and alter the rendering, right? It will alter the state and re-render everything. And then it'll diff it and only change what's necessary. So our people list is the same as before. Let's see if we can do this. I hope I remember this correctly. I think it's IND. That's what the key should be. I hate these overlapping windows. Okay. Okay. So we're gonna go ahead and select the second element because that's the one that changes. It changes from Aurea Juniper to Jonathan Archer, and the element doesn't change. Look, we don't have this jitteriness where it jumps up and down, so even less is rendered, re-rendered and changed. The only thing that actually changes is this part, the name, and this. That's it. There's nothing else. And it actually just changes the inside of it. So it doesn't remove any of these elements. It just says, hey, select this list, this H4, and change the inside of that H4. That is pretty amazing. And this is where all those performance upgrades, work. Imagine if you had 1,000 rows like this, you'd have minimal stuff changing in between them. Well, with Angular, it would re-render every single time, and that's a performance bottleneck. What time is it? Holy shit. Okay, so nothing else changed here, so we can move on to the next. I believe that we can move on to the next. 4 or 5. Okay, no scope, no digest. Where is X? Again, ReactJS is a view layer. There is no HTTP module. There's no resource module. There's no scope. There's no root scope. There's no pub subsystem. There's nothing. It's just a view layer. Vanilla.js and other libraries provide functionality. This is wonderful. This is really awesome because you get to write your own logic and you don't have to worry about doing it the React way. Whereas with Angular, that's what you have to do. You have to keep worrying about doing it the Angular way. Now let's talk about the last part, and that's events. I believe that's my last demo, actually. No, so demo 6. So this is component-to-component communication and updating multiple states. This is important because this is what facilitates an application. You're not going to have just one component updating the children. You're going to want to have children that update the parent. With Angular, you're using directives and two-way binding. With React, you're using more of vanilla JavaScript. I really need to just set the wrapping automatically. Anyway, so let's start at the bottom again. So we're going to go ahead and render the... Oh, crap. We're going to go ahead and render the people. And then we're going to go here and we have people. It still loads up, but there are going to be some things. We're going to go ahead and sort it. So again, this is basic JavaScript functionality. You don't have an ng repeat, equals sort by. You don't have a sort by. You're doing the sorting yourself. This is up to you to do. So you do data.sort, function AB, if, this is basic quick sort logic. So just look it up by yourself. But you can basically say that you want to sort it by name. And if, the name is comes before the other name, it goes first. If it doesn't, it goes last. If it doesn't change, you just do return 0. Okay, that's the same logic. This is just so that it doesn't keep changing. I didn't want to show that in the subsequent demos because it's not relevant. So we have a people list, same as before. We're mapping them, blah blah blah. What you can actually do is you can sort these nodes here. You don't have to sort it over here, but it's up to you. And then we have a person. So person's going to be a little bit different now. It's a little bit more complicated. We're going to have get initial state. And each of those people is going to have its own state. Have they been liked, blocked, or ignored? And then we're going to have this cool callback that's handle action state. So whenever the state updates, we're going to do, we're going to have the state actions, we're going to have the new state, and then we're going to set the new state. So what this basically means is that we're going to, and you see it says new state over here. So if somebody's been liked, we want to make sure that this person component knows about it. But we don't want to handle that logic. We want to have that handled by the meta list that we've been building in the past. We're also going to use this cool internal function that we created for ourselves called build classes that goes through all these different actions, these state components, and creates a class string. So we're going to do that here, var this build class names. So if ignored is false, the person dash ignored class is not added. And I created a bunch of these nice special classes here. Where is it? That's weird. Why don't I have it here? I thought I saved it. I wonder if it... Hold on, let me see if it works. Yeah, okay. Is it really not here? Oh, I do have it. Okay, so it's all the way on the bottom. So when a person is liked, they get a border. If the person is blocked, they get a different color border. If they're ignored, they get a different color border. But again, we don't want that handled here. We don't have an entire list here. Plus, we might want to reuse that list somewhere else, right? What if a comment was liked? What if a tweet was liked? What if, a New story was ignored. We want to have it reusable. So we're just going to have this prop that's on action state change. And what this prop is going to do is basically, we're going to provide it with a callback. That callback is going to get the new state. So this is our callback, handle action state, and it's going to alter our state for the person. So let's look at the meta list. So again, a little bit more complicated. We're going to get an initial state. The initial state is going to be this. Everything's false. We're going to have this handle action. Handle action is going to be whenever somebody likes or dislikes or blocks or ignores whatever. What do we want to with that? What do we want to happen with that? The handle action gets an event. We can do event target inner HTML, which we'll get. I'll go through all this. Let's go through render. We want to make sure that the render, we want to make sure that the text is correct. So if somebody's been liked, we want to make sure that it says unlike. If somebody's been blocked, we want to make sure the button says unblock. If they say ignored, we want to say follow. That's kind of the best that I can think of, right? And so we render them straight in here, and we're going to do onClick. This handle action. Now onClick is not the onClick that you know from JavaScript. This is an internal function that React uses. So it's evented. It's not the onClick that you're used to. It actually follows proper techniques and whatever else. It bubbles up and everything. So we're going to do this handle action. So whenever you click, it's going to go to this handle action. That handle action is going to get the event. The event, you can get the target, which is what was clicked, and you get the inner HTML. The reason we're getting that is so that we can use one single function for each one of these and have it control all of these states. So we don't want to handle action like, handle action block, handle action ignore. We want to just have a handle action. So it goes into this internal dictionary where like and unlike, same type, same type, same type. It gets the state, it flips the state. Basically, if you do an exclamation mark, true, it'll change into false, exclamation mark, false, it'll change into true. Prevent default, so we don't want it to actually go to this place, which is just a hashtag. If you can't see it, just hashbang or whatever. Or it's just a hashtag. Then we set the new state, and then after we set the new state, which will cause a re-render, we use the onActionStateChange prop and update the new state. So when you click on like, this thing will switch the like to unlike, and it will set the state, so this will re-render. Then that state will get passed to our onActionChange, which will get passed to, see right here, which will trigger this, the handle action state, with the new state. And let's see what that looks like. So when you click like, it's gonna re-render and change. Crap. This really sucks. When you click like, and it sets the new state, it runs render again, which means it rebuilds the classes for that specific element. And that's a good thing, because in this case, when you like somebody, it shows a green bar on the right. When you block somebody, it's a red bar. If you ignore somebody, it's an orange bar. If you stack them, it really depends on the order of your classes. But that's up to you and your styling. So cool. So now we have two different components talking to each other. You may notice it's a little bit difficult, because it means that if we want to have an action that's 3 components deep, bubble all the way up, we have to keep passing that what do you call it? We need to keep passing that callback, but that's not very efficient. I love tea. That's not very efficient, which is why Flux was why people came up with Flux. So we talked about component-to-component communication, updating multiple states. We updated the state of 2 different components, parent and a child. So what just happened? So again, React is just a view layer. So it'll keep running re-render, it'll keep running all this other logic. It's not meant to handle complicated logic. So if we had some super complicated logic, you wouldn't stick that into render. And you wouldn't want to have that part of your component view. What you would want to have it is part of a different class or part of your own library, right? And you may not always want to render or run all that complicated logic. But yeah, I mean, it can get easily convoluted. I mean, this is just a simple example, but imagine, you know, you would have to have that meta list send this new state to the person. The person would have to, you know, send off, the person component would have to send off an HTTP request to the server to tell it that that person's been liked, and that may update another part of the view. And it's like, how do you sync all this stuff? So there's an issue with syncing states. You know, there's no two-way binding. It's one directional. It's unilateral. And that's kind of where Flux comes from. And I'll tell you more about that. So you may notice there are no routers, no filters, no helpers, no ng repeat, none of this stuff. It's all stuff that you have to come up with. And some people have built, you know, replacement for ng repeat, but if you work with JavaScript, it's better to have a JavaScript solution than, you know, this ng repeat like solution. And I supply an entire list of complementary tools with React. You can go ahead and look at it. It's from Facebook. It provides you with some cool stuff like, you know, how to build your JSX components, starter kits, and, you know, how to do routing. There's Director. Backbone does routing, can do routing for your React. You can actually use Backbone and React together, and it's totally fine. There's the React router. There's Aviator, Finch. Like, there's all this other stuff. You can pick how you're gonna do routing. You can pick how you're gonna do model management, data fetching. You know, the React Ajax, somebody built a component. It's not by Facebook. So you kind of put together your own tools. And that can get confusing because JavaScript is just that, isn't it? You know, Node and front JavaScript, it's you putting together all these components and making things to work together. And usually best standard practices and best practices help you figure out what tools to use and how to use them. And that's kind of where Flux comes from. So let's talk about it. Before we move on, components will have many different internal events. So there, you know, I showed you. Oh man, did I? Okay, crap. Adam, okay. I told you this render method that's internal. I told you this get initial state. Component did mount, that's another event. So these are all kind of events that React will just trigger all those functions along the tree. But there's also component will update. So that's right before a component update. You can tell actually React not to update the component based on the new data. You can tell them like, well, it shows that, you know, there's one extra like, it's not really worth it to render 20 million other, you know, root nodes, or sorry, child nodes, just for that one like. That's an example. I wouldn't do that. But you know, you might get some information from a server and it might have some kind of an internal ID that doesn't really matter, you don't use it, or some internal data that you don't use in your application. So, you know, in the person view, in here in step 6, what if we had a tags property for each person, but we're not using them anywhere? So we might want to specify that, you know, component will mount. If the only thing that changed is just the tags, don't bother re-rendering, and React will ignore that. And then component did update, that's after an update, you know, some post logic that you might want. It's possible to return early depending on state. So what you can do is, I minimized it again. You see how you have here, return like this. What if it was empty? Do we need all this logic? If we have if this dot props dot data dot length is equal to 0. What if there are no people? Do we want to render all this stuff? No, we don't. So we might just want to do actually, I have a better idea. If we have no people that come back, we might want to do this, h4. No people in the list. And this will return early. None of this logic will take place. And that kind of saves you a few CPU cycles, they say, because you don't have to do this mapping. You don't have to go down the tree and try to render all this crap. So yeah, so you can return early. That's kind of cool. Again, it's more regular JavaScript kind of functionality. Best practices utilize various techniques to improve these flows. So let's say one of the best practices that I mentioned was using the index location. Whenever you're doing the mapping, using the index location of that element. Instead of using person.name, you would do ind that you get from the mapping. And that helps performance. Returning early when you have an empty data set or whatever, that's another point. Utilizing these component will update, that's another place where you can, save a few cycles, because you can say, well, none of the information I care about gets updated. There's no reason to re-render. And React is ES6, ES 2015 ready. Again, that's important to stress because it makes your code much cleaner. And I'd love to show you an example of it, but I don't have that set up. I will have that set up for my Flux video. So enter Flux. Just to give you a quick overview of what Flux does, you can see it's my last slide. It's an application architecture, so it's not a library. I want to stress this. It's not a library. You don't do import Flux. You don't do Bower install Flux. Flux is a way, describes a design pattern, basically. Describes information and process movement unidirectionally, and it's hella confusing at first. But when you start to look at it, you start to realize that it makes sense. And you know what, let's look up that image for that. Flux architecture. And I can React. Flux architecture. Okay, so I think, let's see. I think this one's kind of I remember for this being from one of the talks. There we go. Okay. So I'm gonna zoom this in, make this really blurry. So if it's blurry on your screen, it's blurry on my screen too. Don't worry about that. So this is Flux. It looks confusing. Basically, instead of having all these views cascade, you have all these other parts that you might not necessarily care about. But it kind of starts to make sense to you once you recognize what happened. So let's say you have this view, right? And it's our step 6 view, and we have this onClick. Where is that onClick? Here, onClick. So instead of updating this callback, what we might want to do is make sure that wow, that's a bad start. Let me start from the beginning. If there are some states, if there's a state that certain parts of the application share, you might not want to keep passing it down the line. You might want to store it in a store. A store is basically a way to register data. And whenever the data changes, it updates to views. So basically what you're doing is saying that person is a store. That person's going to be available to all these different views, right? So that may not be related to each other. They might be children to each other. There might be like, parent-children relationship. There might be sibling relationships. They might be completely unrelated. It might be on the other side of the application. For example, whenever you like somebody, there might be a counter that says how many times you liked something today, right? Or it might have a list of people that you liked today or something like that, right? So it's a little bit unrelated. So the store has that information, and that information gets distributed to all these different views that may or may not be related. And let's say you want to update the state, this store. So whenever you click on like on a person, instead of that like having to handle a bunch of callbacks to go up the tree and traverse this entire structure, it'll issue this action. This action will send the payload data and say, this person was updated and was liked. It'll go through this entire process. So it's an action. That action will go to an API and will tell, hey API, hey server, this person was liked. Meanwhile, this action is going to send this information to a dispatcher. Dispatcher receives the event and may say, hey, this was view generated like or some, I don't know, it doesn't really matter, but it can say that, hey, this person was updated, we got to do something about it. Why don't we update all the stores that include this person that have a registered callback? And you basically, instead of registering a callback with views and passing it down, you register it with the data that you want updated. Again, it's more of a store machine. So we like a person in the view, it goes to the action. This is like a quote-unquote controller. The action sends information to the API and tells it, hey API, we updated the like. The API comes back and says, it's been updated. Okay, cool, we move along. We send that information to a dispatcher. And that dispatcher says, okay, well, person's been liked. There are 10 different stores or models or whatever you want to call it that want to know, if this information has been updated. So you update, the dispatcher updates all of those, or the stores update themselves, and they in turn fire an event basically, and they say, we've been updated. All the views that depend on us update, and the views update. And that's basically what Flex is. It's really easy to explain. It's a little bit more difficult to actually show. And the reason why this unilateral, this circular approach is good for building architectures is because you don't get into issues where you're out of sync. And you don't get into issues with views that are unreachable by other views, or having to handle these callbacks. But anyway, so that's it. Feel free to ask questions on under the YouTube video. Sorry that this took so long. I'm pretty sure I've already run more than an hour and a half on this video. I will be creating a Flex video once I have some time. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this.